Well, why don't we go ahead and get started? I am very excited that we have this fabulous panel that is going. Do you want to advance the slide to the next slide? Excellent. We want to talk about messaging and disinformation, and we have our esteemed panel. Nick, who is one of our partners from Burness Communications, who helps us on a daily basis. Rob, who is a director of strategic communications for the Consortium, who also helps us on a daily basis. And Colin, who we adore and miss desperately, who was our director of policy and has gone on to a fabulous job in the solar industry, and we miss him every day. And so we're thrilled that he was able to join us from California and join us for this panel. So I'm going to turn it over to the gentleman, and I think it's going to be a great session.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm not here for a second opinion, but if anyone has one, let me know. So I'm going to kick us off today, just talking a little bit about the messages we're working with. The context here is about misinformation, but I think it's important to step back and think about where we are and just revisit the point of why the health voice is so important. The landscape has really changed since the consortium launched in 2017. At that point, there was, I think, not great understanding of the fact that climate change was a health issue. Fortunately, today, we're at a place where it's much more understood and it's really readily accepted. So our job today is less about saying, here's the problem. It's more about reminding people, this is a health issue and here are the solutions. And so Rob's going to go through that a little bit. But these are a few of the things that have changed over the last 5-6 years. I think the last one is really important for what Colin would be talking about today, which is the misinformation, and what we're up against has also changed. That landscape has evolved, and it's really important to understand what we're up against and the power of sort of inoculating against it by being out there first, speaking clearly and giving good messages on solutions and what we're up against. As a reminder, probably most of you have thought about this and have heard about this, but you all are the most effective messengers on one of the most effective ways to talk about climate change, and that's as a health issue. You have an ability to talk about what's happening now and do it in a really compelling way that is it's trusted. And again, by getting that out there earlier, you're able to sort of preempt the evolving misinformation that's coming out that we're up against. So a couple of the things we want to think about as we're talking about communicating on climate and health solutions, one of the most important things you can do is really to localize and personalize the messages. Talking about what you've seen, what you experience, and doing it in a way that resonates with what your audience has seen and experienced. The local voice is just incredibly powerful here. We want to think about how we're laying a positive vision for the future. Illustrating what can be is really important because sometimes it's hard to envision the future. And a lot of audiences and a lot of us as humans will sort of stay with a less certain present than a questionable or unclear but better future. So we really want to illustrate what we're building towards. We want to still make sure that we're naming the ways that climate change is harming health and making it explicit. The good thing is if we say it simply and clearly, people accept it and we can move right on to where we want to be, which is talking about the solutions. The other thing that's really important is that if we just talk broadly about solutions and solutions will help, it's a lot less compelling than giving specific solutions and specific examples. That's where people activate because people are really thirsty for things they can do. I was involved in some focus groups a couple of years ago, and I remember someone was saying, I want to do something, but I don't know what. I bought an electric car, but I just don't know what I should do. And it was like, well, that's a pretty good start. And so helping people see what those solutions are is really critical. And the other thing that we really need to do is help people understand why there are inequities in climate change and the health impacts. It's not intuitive to a lot of folks. We're talking about a global phenomenon, and so some people struggle with the idea that it's affecting everyone, but affecting some people more. We all understand why, but we have to really make that clear and articulate it explicitly. So that, I'm going to hand it over to Rob to talk through the next slides.
What is that next slide? Oh my goodness. Okay, so a couple of things. Which is forward? The right, thank you. I need my instructions. Just a couple of things right at the beginning to build off what Nick said, is that, you know, when we talk about messaging, don't think about messaging atomistically. You know, what are the 4 things I need to get across in any particular order? It doesn't matter. You're always telling a story. And great stories are personal. Great stories have lots of specifics that people remember. If I tell you over the weekend, I went to my grandson's birthday party, and it was really great. 5 weeks from now, I guarantee you will not have one inkling that I ever said anything. But if I tell you one of the kids mistook the clown for a piñata and bopped his nose off, you're going to remember that. In fact, you'll probably remember that now. That didn't, okay. So the idea of specifics is really important in telling a story. So that's just my, and local. You know, people talk about global warming. Well, people do care about that, but they care a lot more about what's happening in their community. And you have a chance to be an amazing storyteller on climate and health. So here are the key messages, but think of it as a narrative. The first, that should be on aspiration. Back one. Is you start a story, you know, and with a purpose. Your purpose is to say, here are the values and aspirations and ambitions we share. That's the beginning of your story. We care about clean water, clean air, and stable communities. And I care about that as a health professional. You should anticipate your audience at this point is saying, nodding their heads and saying, yes. And what you're trying to build is a shared ambition. We have a shared ambition. And you're going to get, don't worry about the words on these slides, because we have a handout with these exact words on them. So I'm not going to go through the exact words. Now there should be behind me the word challenge, because that's the next part of the story. What's stopping us from achieving these ambitions? And the idea here, the key thing is fossil fuels, pollution, climate change together now. Because we're at a point now where we want to say those are 2 sides of the pollution coin. And if we address them, we're going to be healthier and we're going to get those stable communities that we want. We also, in this challenge, name our opposition. These are the people who are trying to stop us from achieving that. And I want to emphasize here that everything I'm talking about in terms of everything we talk about in terms of messaging isn't baked up in some room that communication people go into. It's guided by research and communication. So the idea that you can name your opposition, don't worry. We know that it works. It helps us get people engaged. It inoculates them, we believe, against misinformation that Colin will talk about. So here we want shared experience and shared concern and a shared sense of urgency. Now, again, as Nick said, we know people are much more aware of the health harms of climate change now than they were 7 years ago. So we don't have to dwell on this, but it has to be specific and it has to be personal and it has to be local. And then you've got them. You really, and people are nodding their heads again. They have a shared sense of urgency. Here's where you introduce the idea of equity. These harms are not equally distributed, but the key point when you talk about the equity message is to say, get your audience to understand the idea of through no fault of their own, people are suffering. be it because they're pregnant, because they're babies, because they're old, because they have pre-existing conditions, and because they live in communities that have been discriminated against by policies that have put them in harm's way. And again, the message testing we did showed that this works, and it works across the political spectrum to talk about equity. We want to spend a lot of time in our story now talking about solutions, because that's where people are. We've got solutions at hand. That's what they're concerned about. What will this change mean? As Nick said, people don't automatically want change. They want change that they can feel confident will work for them. So here in our solutions, concentrate not only on personal stories and specific solutions and local impacts, but now focus on the immediate health benefits that these solutions will give us. Because solving global warming is a 50-year or 20-year, we're talking about the future. But when we're talking about the health benefits of solutions, we're talking about next year. And here you should have what your audience should be experiencing is a shared enthusiasm. This isn't drudgery here. This isn't risk. This is going to be great. And by the way, we all have a great story to tell each other about how great it will be. The final message is your message of hope. And there darn well better be a hope slide behind me. And that message of hope, the thing to emphasize here about why are we hopeful in this horrible world that we're living in and all of these threats? We are hopeful because we are together, because we have momentum. The declarative norm of things are changing and people are changing in the right direction is a very, very powerful way to get people to not just have a shared sense of urgency, not just have a shared concern, not just to have a shared sense of enthusiasm, but to have a shared sense of optimism and confidence that we can get there. So those are your messages, but try to think of them as the story you're going to tell. And it's your story, and you are the most important and best storytellers. And I will now hand off to the discussion of the enemies.
All right, I'm going to stand up here. Start off by saying thanks again to the consortium team, Nick, Rob, everybody. I know how much work goes into this meeting, and so it's just so awesome to be back here with you all, and especially many of you that we've worked together over the last 5 years or so, and it's just great to be back. These are the great examples of supporting messages. I'm going to shift a little bit. So if you have some questions for Rob and Nick, write those down, because I'm going to dive into kind of an issue and a landscape where these messages that Nick and Rob just reviewed are going to be helpful. But my goal today is to talk a little bit about kind of the landscape of where this messaging is important and where the misinformation landscape of around climate change and climate solutions is occurring. And hopefully provide a little bit of a very basic intro into some of the tangible skills that you might be able to use to counter disinformation or misinformation. As mentioned, I recently joined a renewable energy developer and am kind of on the ground experiencing these kind of issues now. So that's the interesting perspective that I'm encountering now in the field, to testify that this is something that's really occurring. And as health professionals, I think you can appreciate that. I first want to state that my views here are not the views of EDF Renewables or my company, that I'm here as an advocate, talking about an issue that's been really close to my heart for over a decade now. Especially in this building here, there's some good history that we can talk about over some beers. around climate misinformation. But let's jump into the substance of this here. First, got to put this picture up here to just demonstrate why solar is awesome, right? And a good visual representation of the two energy futures that we have ahead of us. Solar is a clean, renewable energy that we are increasingly seeing awesome projects like this where, you know, we can coexist with the land there beneath it. And I first want to start off, you know, because we're spending a lot of time talking about the IRA and where we are and where we are moving forward, that I want to reassure you that y'all's advocacy on the IRA and advancing climate solutions at the federal level is having a profound impact. I'm seeing it every day in our work. It's coming up every day where we're talking about these tax credits and how it's helping really propel renewable energy forward. So I just want to just throw that out there. It's also doing what we fought hard to do and tell representatives that projects are getting prioritized into communities that need them most. That was a big goal of the IRA. There were some areas where it failed, but that we are now seeing because of the tax credits that disadvantaged communities are receiving more investment and that we're trying to build more projects in those disadvantaged communities or energy communities. So little caveat there. What I want to try to squeeze everything into today is, you know, why we should care about this issue, this disinformation or misinformation landscape, what's happened, what's happening now, and what we as health professionals or you as health professionals can do about it. Why should we care? I know this isn't one that I have to kind of convince you of. As you're all here, you took the time to get here. But as you know, we really need to rapidly build and deploy renewable energy like solar and wind if we want to stabilize warming at 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius by 2100, avoid catastrophic warming. And the science is clear that, you know, in the next decade or two, we really have to accelerate our deployment. I want to reemphasize that because the urgency, one of the major ways that we can help with this urgency is fighting climate delay tactics, which I'll talk a little bit more. Any efforts that might slow our ability to rapidly decarbonize our energy, transportation, industrial systems. This is obviously an optimistic graph, right? We have made a lot of progress over the last 10 years. We are deploying utility scale solar, this big gold bar at record pace. But what this map shows a little bit, right, is that this is kind of the current footprint of wind and solar energy across the US right now. So you can see there's quite a bit of blue there, especially in the Midwest. And it's hard to see all these little orange dots, but there are tons of them, especially across the Southeast. But the kind of sobering point, right, is that this is what we need to be moving towards. Wind and solar are going to be a big part of our future, and to get there, we have to deploy fast. And you know, that means all over the country, that means in every state. It means especially a lot of wind energy in the Midwest and using that as a strong base load power. And so we still have a big path ahead of us. So real quick, what's happened? I feel really fortunate today to talk about our colleague, John Cook, who used to be here with us at the Center for Climate Change Communication, and then is the foremost expert, in my opinion, I think in all of our opinions, on climate denial and how to combat climate misinformation. And what John and his colleagues have shown is that over time, we've seen the misinformation landscape around climate change shift from outright science denial, from outright saying, you know, it's not us causing it, it's not even happening, it's not bad. That is slowly trending downwards, and we've seen the uptick in solutions won't work. And this is true both across you know, think tanks that put out this type of information, as well as these denial blogs that I think many of you have probably come across that really help perpetuate this misinformation across social media. And so John Cook and his colleagues have this is some pre-publication research that really shows, using machine learning, they've drudged through thousands and thousands of online pieces to show that this trend is now increasingly moving into this space of solutions won't work. And if you follow climate politics, you can probably notice this too. And that's thanks in part to work that you all do and that climate advocates do, because politicians realize it's harder to talk about science denial. People, whether Republican or Democratic, understand that the science is real, that there's a human influence on it. And so the narrative has shifted away from that outright climate science denial. And just a little subset of this data is that clean energy won't work is a big part of that climate solutions don't work. And so this is what we're talking a bit about here today. A lot of the focus, obviously, that you hear is that clean energy is not going to work. And there's a variety of myths around that. So what's happening now? The manifestation of this trend around climate solutions won't work over the last few years has been increasingly around the viability and importance of clean energy, often around myths around the potential health impacts of clean energy, which is really relevant for you all and for you all to be aware of and be able to speak out against. And then there are other direct disinformation campaigns that genuinely seek to just discredit folks who advocate for clean energy in general. And so these articles really in the last year into some amazing journalists and NPR, folks like Michael Thomas and Emily Atkin, who I encourage you to follow, have really started to document how this misinformation is taking root in communities across the country. It often starts in things like Facebook groups in local communities where folks start to share memes of, wind turbines on fire, or, that there's toxic chemicals leaching from a project, kind of all of these myths and misinformation that slowly permeate and ultimately lead to opposition against renewables. And at the same time, when you can kind of see how organic opposition might kind of bubble up in a community, there's also direct disinformation campaigns that are now being funded and supported by longtime political operatives coming from, actually here in the DC area, to folks that have worked with fossil fuel industry for decades, that are now realizing the opportunity that they have to come in and help take what is organic opposition or concerns and provide them with information, with toolkits, with resources to then build actual strong campaigns against renewable energy projects. And so that's being documented well by these journalists, and it's not new. We've probably heard about the anti-wind kind of campaigns, and there's some long-time active political operatives that have been, running for over a decade, really deliberate campaigns, PR campaigns against renewables, and they're not shy about their efforts to influence media and that kind of thing. So we're seeing these kind of trends arising with what we call astroturfing, right? Like I just mentioned, where there may be some organic concern or opposition, but a group coming from above is coming into a community, and instead of being a grassroots effort, it's an astroturf effort. You might be familiar with that. This is becoming more and more frequent. We've seen things like paid witnesses to go to public utility commissions. Again, what those journalists have documented happening. Landowners who want to lease out their land for solar energy projects or wind projects are increasingly, having to be escorted out of rooms like this with police, escorts, because it's just getting that tense around these battles. And really what it's leading to and kind of what the misinformation, ultimately over time leads to is local, county, and state policies that are actually prohibiting renewables development and renewables projects from getting built. And so this is the opportunity that we have to, really act as a frontline defense, as advocates, as grassroots folks to help address this issue. And so, like I said, the way that is materialized is, pretty much every state now has had a solar or wind project that has been stopped by or delayed by local opposition. But even more concerning, local governments in 31 states have passed restrictive policies that just outright say you're not allowed to build solar in this community. And we're increasingly see that. And of course, just to highlight, that's a goal. There's folks like this, this gentleman that is going across the country and joining these Facebook groups and helping people try to intimidate their local politicians to oppose solar projects. So I first, before we dive into a little bit of kind of the common myths, and these aren't things you have to remember or memorize. We'll share them, and I think it'll take some time to kind of understand, really what they are and where they're from. But I want to first start out by saying, and I think you all are, kind of on board with this, right? But we know that wind and solar are cost competitive. It wouldn't be growing at the exponential rate that it is if it wasn't. And actually that many fossil fuel plants across the country, especially coal plants, are uneconomical. We should be replacing them just for cost alone. And we know that renewables, especially paired together with things like battery storage, can be effective baseload power sources that we can rely on to keep the lights on, through storms, through bad weather situations that we're seeing in Texas. And we know that the total pollution produced from the mining and building of renewables, which there is some for the silicon and the components, the glass that goes into building the panels, that kind of thing. We know it's there, but we know its magnitude's lower than fossil fuel pollution, right? And it's not a continually generated source of pollution. It's offset within a couple of years of a system being online. So some of the myths that you might come across, especially related to health, are things like wind turbines cause cancer. This is probably the most notable one because President Trump had said it on TV a few years ago. But there's also other ones that I actually encounter in my day job now too, that radiation from solar panels can cause cancer, that solar panels leak toxic materials like cadmium and PFAS, which you're probably familiar with, and that solar panels melt birds. And I know this sounds silly, but it's genuinely, in just the 6 months I've been, talking to landowners and trying to get projects built, I've come across this twice now, that folks are like, well, somebody mentioned it to me, or I saw this picture on Facebook that that solar, is dangerously hot. It can melt birds. So I, as health professionals, I don't want to try to spend too much time on the kind of refutations here. But, there was a lot of good research and actual peer-reviewed studies done after this that many international societies can tell you that, low frequency sound is not likely linked to cancer. Yes, there are some, especially with wind turbines, there's especially, some sound issues that folks might be concerned with, but that statement itself is not accurate. Radiation from solar panels, we know that exposure to very, very low levels electromagnetic fields, that there's no evidence that it's harmful to health. But even beyond that, nobody is really near solar panels as they're operating. This isn't something that people are actually being exposed to. It's an example of kind of taking a logical fallacy, what we'll talk about in a minute. PV panels are self-contained. Less than 5% of panels across the world actually use cadmium in the panels. It's kind of an older technology, thin film solar, that isn't used as much. Yes, if they get broken, there could be temporarily, an issue with the materials inside getting exposed to water or rain, that kind of thing. But again, as we all know, in the context of these panels being having a 40-year life, that's minimal risk, that it's not actually something that's occurring at scale. Solar panels don't really get that hot, 70 to 120 degrees. Yes, it is warm on a really warm day. But I think it's just important to specifically note this myth because it's an example of how it can start somewhere, which started with this technology called parabolic mirrors, which is not the solar that you see solar farms. It's a completely different technology out in the Nevada desert that was kind of experimental, and it points mirrors up towards a tower, and that tower does get really hot. And there was potential for birds that got near that tower to get harmed, right? But I say that because that's completely separate from what solar photovoltaics are, what these solar farms are in the field. And it's an example how misinformation can go from, this one-off project in Nevada that really isn't being built anywhere in the world now, but it's been translated over to just talking about renewable energy in general is dangerous. These are some other things you might come across. And again, kind of just to reemphasize that in your work, you don't necessarily have to be, have a standard answer or an expert kind of response to this or a canned response. But it's good to know that they're out there so that you can help inoculate folks against these arguments when they do come up. Because you likely will encounter them in your advocacy. You might have somebody come up to you after a presentation and say, hey, you said clean energy is so great, but I've heard that wind turbines kill a lot of birds. And, is that something that, we should really be doing? If you want to remember that exponentially more birds are killed by hitting windows and by cats than they are by wind turbines. Yes, it's an issue. We shouldn't outright ignore it, but it's helpful, when folks are cherry picking information to point that out, right? That this is something that, yes, it's an issue we should address. The industry is looking at ways to reduce bird deaths, but it's something that is helping us, reduce harm from fossil fuels in general. And ultimately, even if you want to kind of shy away from trying to, combat or have to memorize arguments like this or issues like this, you can always lead with the messages that Rob and Nick just talked about, that overall, we know cleaner energy can help reduce premature deaths and respiratory illnesses by thousands a year. I think you all are well familiar with that, and we've heard a good amount of that today. So I'm going to end with just like I mentioned, our colleague, John Cook, and his colleagues have really done a tremendous amount of research to understand how to effectively combat misinformation. And don't worry about trying to memorize this today. I don't think you'll, it's not something that you can memorize overnight, but if you can just remember fact, myth, fallacy, that's, I think, a good start. And there's a lot of good resources out there on this, a lot of good lectures by John Cook online. You can go to skepticalscience.com or the Center for Climate Change Communication website to read the debunking handbook that actually walks through all of these strategies and tactics. And even John and his colleagues also did work directly around vaccines and misinformation. And so there's even a handbook specifically dedicated to that issue. But I'll just briefly review some of the strategies that you can use if you encounter misinformation. It's good, as I think Rob mentioned, we talk about this concept of inoculation that John and his colleagues have found to be really effective to get the correct information out there first. I know you all are familiar with the concept of inoculation, and that it can be a defense against future myths that might come their way, try to make their way into their brain. And if there's already a little bit of that information in their head already, that you can inoculate them against the misinformation. And so this is really important for folks like local politicians, local county board members, that kind of thing. So start out by stating the fact first in a few words. Try to keep it simple, as simple as the myth itself. So, if we're talking about, that solar panels cause cancer, try to keep that fact that they don't fairly simple and straightforward. And don't rely on just saying that's not true. I think we all come across that sometimes when it's like, of course that can't be true. I don't have enough time to explain to you how false that is, but we have to actually take a little bit of time just to connect with folks and explain why something is not factual. And so if you're able to kind of switch out in someone's understanding of the issue with the fact first, that really sets you up well to then talk about the myth. And as their research has showed, it's good to only repeat the misinformation once directly prior to your kind of refutation of that myth. So don't spend a lot of time kind of honing in on the myth and repeating it a bunch of times, especially if you're sitting up there kind of testifying or having a conversation with someone. Needless repetitions of that myth just make it more prominent in someone's mind. It's also an effective tactic to help folks understand or become suspicious or of the source of intent of the misinformation that they're getting. So again, like I just showed you, if maybe one of these folks is coming from a group that has worked closely with fossil fuel companies in the past, you might understand that they have a little bit of a bias against renewable energy. And so helping folks understand why that misinformation might be coming from that source can be helpful. So repeating that myth. And then a little bit of the kind of more complex part of this, which takes some practice, but I think this is just a good introduction. Explain the fallacy. Try to break down why that myth or that misconception around the issue is false, especially if you can do it kind of from a logical perspective. So John and his colleagues have a great way to explain this. An acronym called FLICK are some of the common logical fallacies that you can use to break it down. The only one I think I'll point out today here is cherry picking, right? That's kind of an easy one to understand and one that we see in a lot of these cases, right? So if you can point out that somebody is taking one data point from a very broad set of data points and saying that's the ultimate truth, and holding that up, that one example of, say, a wind turbine catching on fire and saying this is going to happen all over the country, that's an example of showing somebody that this is cherry-picked data that we need to delve more into. And so, and a good, I think, way, luckily, kind of countering disinformation and uncovering logical fallacies and kind of taking the time to understand why arguments are built poorly and how you can kind of break them down is helpful outside of just this climate misinformation landscape, right? We've obviously seen a lot of this with anti-vaccination issues and being able to help folks understand that, where the logical fallacies might come into play. So, just to sum that up and to give you the link to this debunking handbook, if you want, they also recommend, if you have the capacity or you have the time, repeat the fact at the end of this. So fact, myth, fallacy, fact. Leave that person, the last thing that they hear about rather than this logical fallacy is the fact again itself, and just take the time to reiterate that, especially if you're kind of giving a presentation. So that was an introduction to this kind of strategy. Hopefully you can take some more time to learn about that if you're interested. I would just want to talk a couple minutes about opportunities, I think, to engage in this landscape of climate misinformation and solutions misinformation in what I think is a really important area, as we're continually seeing across the country, solar projects that take years to develop, and the landowner it wants to lease their land out to build this solar project because, for various reasons, maybe they want to keep the land in their family, but they can't afford to farm it anymore. Maybe it's a bunch of siblings that own the land. Whatever it may be, the landowner wants to move forward with the solar project, and ultimately local opposition builds, and these AstroTurf efforts help build opposition to a project that leads to, say, a county government striking down the project, voting to either not give it the permit that it needs, or to just outright ban solar project developments in their community. So as health professionals, I think y'all can play a really helpful role in this effort in engaging locally, especially as we move from the IRA era, as I think Matt said yesterday. We're now back in a gridlocked Congress. We need to move IRA investments from, now that they're supercharging industry, we need to, again, focus on the local and state level and use our voices there. And so this is a big opportunity to do that. Help kind of get ahead of the issue in talking with your county board, even if it means just going and spending 2 minutes at a council meeting, a city council meeting, and talking about how, hey, renewable energy might come to our community soon. Solar is likely to come to our community soon. This is why it's a good thing. And that can help, again, inoculate against the misinformation that might crop up later. This is especially true for folks in rural communities, right? Because that is where a lot of this solar, large utility scale solar is getting built. So there's lots of opportunities there at the city council level, the county board level, but also the public utility commissions. And I know a lot of folks in the state groups here have done work with local utility commissions. But that is a great place, to testify where fossil fuel projects either have the chance to get shot down, or you can encourage the utility, the Public Utility Commission to pursue more renewable energy and push utilities to pursue more renewable energy. I know this seems basic, but don't be afraid to engage online. John Cook's research, shows that, especially in this era of social media, that, it's not that we need to kind of fight climate deniers or trolls on the internet in that sense, but if there is a local, a friend or a local Facebook group where you see something crop up, one of the big benefits of just, linking to an article or explaining to them why that this myth is false is that there's tons of people out there that will read that comment, even if it's aside from the person that you may be thinking you're trying to convince. And they've actually documented this. It's called observational correction, and it can be actually pretty impactful. We also need a lot more peer-reviewed research on the health benefits and any potential health threats from large-scale solar farms, which we know are likely minimal, but we need to be able to point to the research to say this is something that is good, and we don't have much of that out yet. We don't have reports that we can point to say this isn't going to harm your community. There's lots of good research that's coming out on land value, because that's one of the big arguments that say solar is reducing the value of your land because people don't like it. And there's good data out there that folks are now starting to publish to show that's not the case. And again, even if you don't have the time or you don't encounter this misinformation, the easiest way to help out in this fight is just to spread the message that clean energy is better for our health, especially against the alternative of a fossil fuel dominated future, which we've been in and we're moving away from. So I will stop there, and thank you.
And we have time for a few questions. If I can ask folks to go to the microphone so that our online participants can hear. And I'm going to turn it to, while people are moving to the microphone, I'm going to turn it to Kimberly.
Okay, Colin, we do have questions for you in the chat. So our first question is, in the Southwest, we are seeing opposition to large-scale solar from the left due to construction of desert habitat and the power that electric utilities derive from large-scale rather than rooftop projects. We are seeing opposition to mining of critical minerals for batteries due to the ecological destruction of mining. Do you have any resources to study or address these types of concerns?
Yeah, that's a really great question and a valid question. And I think, as I briefly mentioned, we can't just brush away every concern about renewable energy. I had a note in there to say that, folks understandably have concerns, especially in a rural community, about industry coming into their community and saying, we know what's best for you. We get that. I think that's good. It's healthy to have a dialogue about that. So we should start there. We shouldn't immediately dismiss folks that, might be organically, genuinely concerned about the land and just dismiss them outright. There is some good research out there, or I wouldn't say research, there's some good articles out there about land use, and like I mentioned, the pollution offsets of using renewables or mining for renewables versus fossil fuels, and that we still know that the payoff is a lot higher there. There isn't, I don't think, a centralized hub for those types of resources, again, which is the kind of argument I'm hopefully trying to get across, that we need more of that centralized work. I will say, I think an issue that comes up a lot, and something actually I used to genuinely believe, is that, we should be focusing more on rooftop solar or solar on parking lots rather than these large scale solar projects out in the desert or out in farmland. And I think that's still a good conversation to have, but the reality that I'm now seeing in the field is that if we want to deploy fast and keep rates low for ratepayers, because renewables are still new and we're struggling to still try to compete cost-wise against fossil fuels, is the cheapest way to build energy is at scale and in the ground. It costs often 2 to 3 to 4 times more to put solar on a roof, especially if you're trying to just lease a roof space, say like a warehouse, and then sell that power to the utility. It's a lot harder to get a utility to want to build those projects. And so the projects that ultimately win and get built are the larger ones that have, these kind of economies of scale that are can generate a lot more power without having to, drill into a roof. So I think that's just a helpful thing to understand, that, part of our efforts to do these large scale projects is to keep costs low still, because ultimately ratepayers, folks who are paying their power bills are the ones they're paying for this energy.
Hi, so Mark Peternick, and hi. So I'm Mark Peternick, and I come from a giant silo called California. And many people probably saw this series of articles about the solar fight in rural Ohio that was really fascinating and I found disturbing. I would also say that when I look at physicians more broadly, and I visit my college and I'm hearing this experience from others, it's really a minority of physicians who are climate advocates, let's say. And so my question is, when you go to these areas like rural Ohio, and we're talking today about the health voice maybe changing people's minds, where is the health voice there? Do you find that physicians in those areas are allies, or they're really, I don't want to say enemies, but, and then if so, how do we reach them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think a tough one that I don't necessarily know the answer to yet. I have seen examples, right, of, folks testifying that, there could be health concerns, and there are some refutations of those kind of comments out there. But yeah, it's an issue that I think we still need to rally around. And, if you're in a rural community with one doctor or a small clinic, you can see how that opposition can kind of grow. And it can start from a place of genuine concern, right? Of that's my neighbor's land. I don't necessarily want to see, solar panels there, and turn into this kind of misinformation, carrying forward misinformation about health and trying to use that to influence the process. And so I think just being able to call that out and recognize it can be really helpful. Yeah, I think just being able to engage with folks genuinely and show up at a county hearing or a meeting as a health professional can be really impactful. So hopefully that answer, I know there's no good answer.
Well, here's my answer. Fill this room, fill this Zoom. One of the most important strategy I think we have this year at the consortium is grow this movement and distribute this movement. Because this question is really the question of at this point in our history, which is, will we be there when this issue goes to the state and local level to win the day? We've done remarkable things in the last few years, and the IRA is a capstone of that. But now we're recognizing that we're not just in the business of evangelizing from the message track that I went through. We're in a competitive environment now, and if we're not where we need to be, we can't prevail. So at the end of my core messages narrative, there's always we're all building up to one thing, which is a call to action. Now that call to action can be to the public, it can be to policymakers, but importantly, it can be to our fellow health professionals to say, we have a great story. We're the only ones who can tell it as effectively. Join us. So that's my response.
Thanks, Rob. So for either Nick or Rob, could you please talk a little bit more about the role of the fossil fuel industry in disinformation?
In other words, are they the source of this process? Are they the funders of this? Do they fund the think tanks? Do they fund the AstroTurf efforts? The answer is yes. But I think one of the points I'd make in response to why this question was asked was that it seems if you're a consumer and you're watching television, what you're really seeing is a different form of misinformation called poultryism, which is an ad saying, you know what we're doing? We're at Volcano Fossil Fuels. We are translating cooking oil into renewable. I mean, they're talking about some minor thing that they're doing, or we're all for reducing emissions now. So what people are hearing at the consumer level isn't all this stuff happening online. In terms of mass communication and advertising, all they're doing is saying, hey, now we're part of the solution. You can go to sleep now because all this climate change stuff is going to be taken care of. Don't you worry. And so that wasn't something, that we heard about in this presentation, but it's a very important other element of misinformation, but it's what leads to these questions. What are the fossil fuel companies doing? They seem to be saying they're part of the solution. But yeah, they're part of funding everything that we've been hearing about from Colin.
And I would just add, on the way over this morning, I was listening, I put on the daily podcast and it opened with a fossil fuel company talking about how they're building, clean energy. And I think it's especially harmful because it makes the transition seem inevitable and removes urgency. And so as we can be driving that urgency, it's a critical piece, and it's a total compliment to what Colin's saying. I think about my hometown on the coast of Maine, where they activated sort of fishermen versus wind power offshore. And so when we have it coming from different angles, as Rob was saying, it's just critical to be paying attention to the fact that we need to be building the urgency.
I just want to say, if you listen, if as I was listening to what Colin was presenting, I was a little bit overwhelmed. It's a fire hose of they're doing everything. How am I going to respond to all this misinformation? And I think that's a legitimate response. So you need something like a penicillin, something universal, and it could start with, that's what the fossil fuel companies would like you to believe. But I know as a physician, this is what fossil fuel pollution is doing to our health and to the future stability of our climate, which is all about our health. And then sort of pivot into what we do know, your own expertise, what you know about health, rather than trying to do it, spend time unless you're really, have a platform and a time frame to really get into it. and write testimony or something like that. If you're just doing conversation, is you need to, point out that it's misinformation, point out who's behind it, and pivot to our message.
So I know we could have this conversation going on for another like 4 hours, but it's time for a quick break. And I think our panelists are going to be around. We have another break session later this afternoon. So we'll just keep this conversation going. And if we want to keep focusing and having these more, we can have some online discussions. Our state groups can raise their hand and say they want to talk about this more, and we will gather everyone together. So thanks to our panel. It was fabulous.